Hey guys, it's Nicole and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be repotting my Vanda Rainbow Stars. This is an orchid that I've had in semi-hydro for about 2.5 years. I'm going to be removing it out of this setup. It's got a really extensive root system and it bloomed for me recently for the first time. As you can see, there's a little spike here. But a lot of my Vanda orchids haven't really done well in semi-hydro. I see this one has a lot of roots outside, but I'm curious to see what's going on inside of the pot, just given that semi-hydro has failed for me with a lot of my orchids over the long run. So we're gonna take this out of the pot and see what's going on, and we're gonna come back and repot it in an organic moss setup. So let's get the stones out and see what's going on. So I have this orchid in a self-watering 5-inch pot, and I would leave water in the reservoir, and it is basically in a slotted Repotme pot with a wick on the bottom. I have this set up with some river stones on top, and when I first started growing, I noticed that a lot of growers would talk about the dry layer, so I would put river stones to combat that dry layer. As I'm removing these stones here, I'm noticing that it grew some new fans, which is great. So this orchid has been growing vegetatively really well, despite it taking so long to take off. Well, anyway, back to the river stones, which I'll remove first. Leca does have a very dry top layer, so a lot of times when you're growing in semi-hydro, the top is so dry that it can desiccate some of the brand new root tips. So the river stones was used as a way to kind of combat that. If you guys have been following my videos for the last couple of months, you'll know that I've been talking more about semi-hydro, and I initially liked that, but then I found that a lot of my orchids declined over time. That's not the case with my cattleyas. My cattleyas tend to like semi-hydro, but a lot of my Vandas didn't do well, and my Latoria dendrobium types over time also declined. And some of my Vandas, they took off over time, such as my Neophonetia falcata. That one did really well for a couple of years, and then it declined when it started pushing out a new root system. I just noticed that the roots just wouldn't go. So they just wouldn't adapt to the new system. The old roots were fine in it, but the new roots just couldn't adapt. So we're getting all these stones out, and then we're gonna start freeing this out, getting the leca out, and I'm really curious to see what this looks like, because I'm a little worried that it's not the best root system in here. At least we have a lot of roots on the outside, which is good, but we're about to see what's going on. So let's get this out of the pot and see what 2.5 years in semi-hydro did for this Vanda orchid, if these roots are alive, if all of them died, and what. But we definitely have a ton of algae. So I'm gonna squeeze it right out of this pot, and it's coming out pretty easily, which is a sign that a lot of roots haven't really packed into it as well. I have a different experience with a lot of my vigorous cattleyas where it doesn't want to come out of the pot, but this one is coming out very, very easily. So here it is. We've freed it from the pot. There's a ton of algae in here. That's another downside with semi-hydro. You tend to get a lot of algae, even if you use a mask, if any light gets through. So my first impression upon looking at this orchid is that it's got more roots on the outside than on the inside. So, I mean, look, at least we have those roots that grew on the outside, but let's inspect these roots a little bit more closely. As I'm freeing the roots, I'm noticing that this has another little baby plant. I don't remember it when I potted it up the first time. I'll link that video for you guys. But I am taking this right out of that larger plant. I thought this was part of the original plant. I still think it was growing really well, but I just removed it, and I'll pot that up separately. So now we're feeling the roots, and what we want to do is feel anything that's squishy, and that means it's dead, and anything that's firm, that means it's alive. And I'm seeing a variety of different roots that are alive and dead. Now this isn't so bad. You could kind of see that a lot of roots died that are inside of the leca, like the one that I just picked up, like those just completely disintegrated. So we do have a lot of dead roots that just kind of fell off, and anything that's still attached to it is kind of like firm and kind of holding on, and some of it is a little squishy, so we're gonna cut it off. You can see that some leca is still hanging on to it. But let's start by getting rid of the wick. I'm gonna take my sterilized cutting tools and I'm gonna cut that off since we no longer need it. It looks like it was attached to a dead root. And we'll start inspecting the roots. But first, let's start with this little baby plant here. Unfortunately, the roots aren't so great on this plant. It looks like just a lot of them are dead, and you know, the roots kind of died out as it hit the leca as well, so that's not ideal. So I'm going to grab my cutting tools. I'm going to cut off anything that's really squishy. Now this root here is interesting because it's very firm, but it's very fragile. There's like a little thread that is holding it together. So it's still kind of alive, and that little vein in there is kind of keeping it together. It's not likely to survive very long, but it is firm, so I'm going to keep it. There's a leca that's still attached to some of the roots, mostly that one because it's pretty much dry. So I cut it off. That was very papery. It wasn't alive. I'm being really conservative here and keeping almost everything because it barely has any roots, and I want something to support it up in its new pot. So we'll just leave it as is and get back to the larger plant. So I'm very thankful this has a larger root system, but in looking at the roots that are left, it's basically those aerial roots are perfect right now. They're alive. They grew outside of the leca and they're okay. But there's a lot of dead, dry roots. So you could tell if a root is dead, as I mentioned, if it's squishy, and sometimes you can tell if it's extremely dry. I'm happy to see that we have some new root tips at least, which is fantastic, but there's a lot at the base that was very squishy that I'm gonna get rid of. I'm gonna be more aggressive with this orchid because it does have a much better root system than the little baby plant. So if something's a little bit iffy, I will feel it out, see if it's firm, and then in some cases, you have roots that are squishy and firm, and then I cut the root beneath where it's firm, not to introduce a wound. So I just cut like dead material, and I leave like a tiny bit of dead material at the very top. So that's what I'm looking for right now, kind of seeing those roots that are kind of dead, somewhat alive. This one still has leca in it. It's still, this one is squishy, but the top of it is alive. So I'm doing what I mentioned where I'm feeling that it's firm but squishy, and I'm cutting just underneath the part that's alive. So this helps not introduce an unnecessary wound to the orchid. And definitely that's also why you got to cut your cutting tools as well, just in case. So this one's not so bad. Unfortunately, anything in the pot wasn't great, as you could tell, and we have some new root tips, which is fantastic. I'm going to try to tuck these into the pot, and yeah, we're going to start repotting this. I just feel like anything that was in the leca didn't do so great, but for 2.5 years it wasn't terrible. As we saw with the leca, a lot of that stuff kind of died off and disintegrated when we took it out of the pot. But would I do leca for a Vandaceous type orchid again? Probably not, because I just find that in my environment, it really doesn't like it. So let's get this into the pot and get it into its new setup. So starting with our little baby plant, I have this self-watering pot. I have a lot of them because I had a lot in semi-hydro for a long time. But because I have so many extras, I'm still going to use it, but as a regular pot without using the water reservoir. I'm going to take my, my little baby plant here, and I'm going to take it, even with some of those iffy roots, to hold it down for support. And I'm going to put some fluffy moss in this, and we're just going to cross our fingers and hope that it bounces back. And I'm going to give it some time here with the moss just to adapt, and hopefully it could push some new roots. I'll give this away after a little while once I could see that some new roots have come in. But I found that this is a really nice orchid, so hopefully this little baby plant pushes through. And this one, I'm going to keep the moss fluffy. I don't want this to get too soggy. I'm going to water it as it dries. A lot of times with Vandas, they like to be quite moist, but they also need to dry. So with this setup with the fluffy moss, this should give enough moisture. The pot is quite small, so it should dry within 2 or 3 days of watering it, and it should be good. I do like moss. I had a lot of orchids that were Vandas in coconut husk and clay pots, and I found that those dried out much too quickly. So Moss should hopefully help keep some of the moisture. This one I'm keeping nice and fluffy, and we'll give it some time and see how it goes. So I'll keep you guys posted on this. Moving on to the larger plant, I have this glazed ceramic pot with holes in it. I got this from a plant swap, which is amazing. You could basically swap a plant or bring a pot or something, and I just picked up a bunch of pots. I thought this orchid pot was really cute, so I picked it up. So I put a little moss on the bottom of it, and this orchid is quite a beast. So it's got a pretty big root system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take that root system and I'm going to tuck it inside of this pot. I'm doing my best not to break anything. I did rinse and soak this pretty well. So the roots were a little bit more pliable. So I'm just really carefully tucking everything in, taking the leaves out, and I'm being extra careful with any new root tips. I'm quite happy with the new root tips. I do feel like this orchid grew mostly outside of the pot, not so much inside of the pot, so it wasn't that bad. And I think this orchid is gonna be okay in this setup. It is basically going from a 5-inch plastic self-watering pot to a ceramic open 5-inch pot. So this is not a big deal. Those outside roots are going to get used to the inside pot condition. Sometimes you lose roots, but I don't think that's going to be the case with it because it's still going to get a lot of air from those holes into the pot. So I'm going to put some moss in here, and I'm going to do something a little different. I'm actually not going to keep the moss as fluffy as with the other orchid, and that's because this is a very open, airy pot. In my environment, it dries out a lot in the winter, and in the summer, it is insanely hot. So I don't air condition my grow space, so that means that everything dries out really fast, in many cases within a day. So if I leave this fluffy, it's just going to dry out much too quickly. So I'm going to put it down a little bit more dense in here, just to accommodate for this pot. Let me know down below if you have any questions, but if it were in a plastic pot without holes on the outside like this, then I would do a fluffier mix. But just given the holes, I know that this dries out really fast in my environment, so it's going to get a much denser setup. I think that this is going to dry out for me within 3 days, so that's not bad. I will probably have to water it constantly, even though it's moss. Moss retains moisture, but anything with holes in it in my environment is just... it just needs to be watered a lot more than anything like in a plastic pot. So I'm taking more moss, and instead of making it fluffy, I'm not making it like a plug that a Phalaenopsis comes in. That's way too dense. But I am just trying to fill in all the grooves in there. I'm packing it in a little bit with my finger. I'm not pressing super hard down, but I'm definitely adding probably double the moss that I add for my phals that I keep really, really fluffy. So I'm packing it down quite a lot. I'm really happy to see that we have some new root tips here. So this is going to adapt really well. I really like this pot for this orchid. It's going to get lots of moisture. It's going to get lots of air. I think those aerial roots are going to do great. And speaking of those brand new roots, you could see one of the root tips right there to the right. So I'm going to tuck that down when it's ready to go. And I hope with this setup, we're able to get this orchid to bloom more than it did. It took 2.5 years to give me one spike. Those blooms were very fragrant, which was fantastic. But I'm really liking this setup. I will keep you updated on how it does. This is going to do well, I think. I'm here putting the final touches, adding a little bit more moss. And here's another little extra root that I find. And I think this is going to do great in this pot. This is the final outcome for the Vanda Rainbow Stars. I completely forgot to cut off the spike, but it is ready to go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye.